Thank you for finding the time in busy schedules today to join us to explore the findings of our new report. This is the third in our Destitution in the UK study, which we published yesterday. Some of you may have had the chance to see the findings and the news coverage. This supports our ambition so that we don't live in a society where anyone is destitute. And as you'll hear shortly, there's been a rising tide of destitution since 2018 when we last published the study. It's not right that people lack essentials in our society and go without food, are not able to keep warm and dry and to keep clean. During the pandemic, we've seen efforts to support those in the most precarious positions, but we need more sustained efforts to bring people back from the brink. So today we will first hear from Professor Suzanne Fitzpatrick, who has led the team. It's a study that's been funded by Joseph Rowntree Foundation with additional funding from the Greater London Authority. Professor Fitzpatrick will talk for 20 minutes, presenting the findings from the study, and then we'll hear brief responses from the panelists, and I'll introduce those later on in the webinar. They will focus on the steps we need to take to end destitution. I want to start with a few thanks though, on behalf of JRF and the research team. We are grateful obviously to the research team, and that includes a team of co-authors who've worked with Suzanne and Glenn Bramley, who joins us on the webinar today to answer questions. It's an ambitious study and it needs a huge amount of people to complete the task on time. We're grateful too for the external advisory group, the team at Kantar Public. It's a large team who took a pivotal role in collecting the data from over 100 services, working with local coordinators in each of the case study areas. The services themselves found time in busy schedules to support the study, and we're particularly grateful for their efforts. But of course, our biggest thanks goes to the people who shared their stories. Almost 4,000 service users completed the questionnaire, and 70 people shared their stories with us in qualitative interviews. We're delighted that so many people who've been involved are able to join us on the webinar today. There will be an opportunity at the end to ask questions. You can put them in the Q&A function. The chat isn't available today, and we'll be monitoring that as we go through. It would be really helpful if you could say who you are when you are asking your question. We have a hashtag too, UK Destitution 2020, if you would like to tweet. We'll make the slides available after the webinar. So I'd now like to pass on to Suzanne so she can share the findings of this unique study.
Morning, everyone. I hope my slides are shared properly. Can everyone see them? Yeah. Thanks very much for that introduction, Emma. And before I start, I would just like to reiterate the thanks that Emma gave to everyone who's been involved in this massive collaborative effort on behalf of the whole research team. I mean, way beyond any other research project I've ever been involved in or probably ever will be involved in. This is a massive collective effort, so we really are incredibly grateful to everyone who helped us with this study. I'm going to spend a little bit of time right at the beginning of the presentation saying, just sort of outlining the research aims and a little bit about the methods, but I want to spend most of the time talking about the really headline findings of the research, and hopefully what some of those policy implications arising from it will come out of the discussion afterwards. And then we've got a number of eminent speakers to offer their thoughts after I highlight the main findings of the study. This is always a challenging study. It was particularly challenging this time round because we straddled the before and after COVID world. The quantitative survey aspect of the study was undertaken in autumn 2019, so before COVID hit. And the qualitative part of the study that Emma talked about, the 70 interviews, happened in the midst actually of the first national COVID lockdown. So we revised, refined the research aims sort of halfway through the study to take account of the reality of COVID. So just to summarise, the key research aims were, first of all, to estimate the scale of destitution in the UK in 2019, so to update the 2017 estimates. Of course, that's the pre-COVID scale of destitution. To identify any emerging trends in destitution, again, of course, pre-COVID, but also to identify the early impacts of the COVID-19 crisis and the associated lockdown on people who were destitute when we surveyed them in autumn 2019. I think it's important to reiterate how we define destitution in this study. And also to remind people that this definition is not the definition of the research team, or at least not only of the research team, but it's actually a definition that was developed with experts in the field, but also with the general public. And we published a report which gave a detailed account of the definition back in 2016. But in summary, we define people in this study as being destitute if they have lacked 2 or more of the following in the past month because they can't afford them: shelter, food, heating, lighting, clothing and footwear, and basic toiletries. We also define people as destitute if their income is so low and they have no savings, such that they're unable to purchase these essentials for themselves. So that means that our definition of destitution has 2 elements. It has a deprivation element and it has an income element. The details of exactly the thresholds, both for the income and the timescales over which people lack certain items, are all detailed in the report. But in broad terms, the key thing to bear in mind for the remainder of the presentation is that we have both this deprivation and this income dimension to our definition of destitution. Emma's already made the point that this, as third time I've run this study, is a big, complex logistical challenge, this particular piece of research. And we have produced, my colleague Glenn Bramley, who's also on the panel today, who leads on the quantitative aspects of the study, has produced a detailed technical report for those that want more detail on the methods. But in broad terms, what we did was quite similar to what we did very similar to what we did in 2015 and 2017. But each time we've ran the study, we have expanded it and made it more robust. So our methods this time round were, well, the core of the field work that we undertake with our colleagues at Kantar Public is a user survey of 113 crisis services working with people likely to be at risk of destitution in 18 case study areas right across the UK. So Emma's mentioned we received this time almost 4,000 questionnaire responses in the course of that survey. And with a high response rate as well, 64% response rates. We were very pleased with the success of the survey this time round again. We then, and particularly Glenn Bramley, develops national and annual estimates of destitution, scaling up from the results from these case study areas to the overall national level, by linking it to secondary analysis of over 40 quantitative data sets. So that's a very important part of the study as well. And then finally, we undertake quite a substantial piece of qualitative research as part of this study as well. This time round, we interviewed 70 people who were destitute when we surveyed them in autumn 2019. But we interviewed them, excuse me, between April and early June 2020. In the midst of the first national lockdown. And that gave us the opportunity to explore what the impact, or how people were coping with lockdown and the pandemic, really right in the midst of that sort of first national kind of extraordinary set of measures. We explored people's economic situation, the impacts on their health and well-being, and on their capacity to access essentials, because obviously that's really core to the destitution study. A couple of other points just to make before I move on from methods is that Emma's already mentioned that we had some additional funding from the Greater London Authority this time round, and that allowed us to add 2 extra London case studies. So we went from 16 case studies in 2017 to 18 case studies this time round. The details, as I've said, of the methods are provided in the technical report. And I would just like to pause very briefly to pay tribute again to our colleagues in Kantar Public, the interview team and the research team, who really, again, went the extra mile to ensure that we got that very good response rate, as well as, of course, the local coordinators and all the services that made it possible. So on to the findings, and I hope that many of you saw some of the coverage of the research yesterday, so you'll already have heard, I think, some of these headlines. What we found is that in 2019, over the course of 2019, over 1 million UK households were destitute at some point in that year. That included 2.4 million people, of whom 500,000 were children. This represents a very significant rise in the number of people and households experiencing destitution since we did the last survey in spring 2017. The number of destitute households has increased, we estimate, by 35%. The number of people has increased even more, by 54%, and the number of children by 52%. Now, the reason for that is that the destitute households have on average become larger since 2017. There are more families with children affected by destitution than there were in 2017. And in part, although not entirely, in part, that is because there's been a disproportionate increase in the number of migrant households destitute, which tend to be larger on average than those headed by UK nationals. Another point I want to flag is that the intensification of destitution that we've picked up this time round. I mentioned a few moments ago, we have both an income and a deprivation aspect to our definition of destitution, and more people this time round were destitute on both measures rather than just one or other. We also found that 1/3 of destitute households had no income at all, and that's a larger proportion than in 2017, and included, very shockingly, 46% of destitute migrants had no income at all. Moving on, and I've already started to touch on the profile of people affected by destitution. I mean, in some ways, this is quite similar to what we found in both of the previous studies, with a very strong overrepresentation of single people of working age, particularly single men, and also multi-adult households. But as I've already alluded to, we have seen more families with children in 2019, particularly lone parent families, and that's affected the overall number of people and also children affected by destitution. So those have gone up faster than the overall number of households affected. But it is still worth pointing out that the profile of people who are destitute is somewhat different to the profile, not just of the general population, but also of the severely poor population, which tends to be dominated by lone parents, as you can hopefully see from this slide. Whereas people who are destitute, while lone parents are certainly overrepresented in that group, the largest group and the most heavily overrepresented group are single people. So there is still that distinction. Overall, certainly it remains the case that destitution affects mainly younger people and very few over 65s. We've looked the last couple of times in the study in some more detail at people's housing situation. And again, this differs a lot from that of the general population, but is actually in lots of ways quite similar to that of the severely poor population more generally. So a majority of people or households who are destitute are living in a flat or house of their own, and that's 56%. The next largest category are people living in hostels, refuges, shelters and so on, various forms of homelessness, and that's 20%. But you've also got people in a range of other insecure or otherwise unsuitable forms of accommodation, including 5% of people who were sleeping rough at the point that we surveyed them, but 22% had slept rough over the last month, 5% at the point of survey. I think what's also quite interesting to note is the breakdown amongst that 56% who are living in their own flat or house. That's very strongly orientated towards the social housing sector. So 60% of people who are in their own flat or house who are destitute are social tenants, 30% are private tenants, but only 8% are homeowners, which is obviously completely different to the overall profile in the general population. We ask in the survey about the problems that people have experienced in the last 12 months with a view to trying to get a bit of a handle on what some of the triggers might be for destitution. In this part of the analysis, we get into the more sort of detailed analysis of people's experiences and profiles. We tend to break the overall destitute population down into 3 key subgroups. One are people with complex support needs involving things like homelessness, begging, drug and alcohol problems, offending, or experience of domestic violence. Now that's about that's 19%, a fifth of the destitute population come into that category. And that is the group that tends to have the most problems overall, partly because that's how we define them. So that's the group who are most likely to report problems with relationships, housing, addictions, health, and so on. But the majority, the largest group in the destitute population is what we call the UK other group. That's UK nationals who don't have those complex needs. That's 59% of the destitute population, and they tend to have a particularly high level of debt and benefit problems, and a lot of health issues too. And the remaining 22% of the destitute population are migrants who don't have complex needs. So migrants with complex needs are included in that complex needs group. So a third of that 19% who have complex needs are migrants. But the rest of the migrant destitute population, 22%, tend to report fewer of the issues flagged in this slide than do the UK nationals. But where we find the migrants are worse off than the UK nationals who are destitute is in access to various forms of support. We've already mentioned that migrants are likelier than UK nationals to have access to no income at all. 46% have no income. They're also more likely than UK nationals to report that they've got no access to in-kind help either, to things like food, clothes, and so on. So you can see that in the last column there, the blue, the lighter blue column are migrants without complex needs. And you've got almost 60% of them reporting access to no forms of in-kind help either. In terms of the sort of more general picture on access to support, it is worth noting, it's important to note, that the majority of UK nationals who are destitute do have access to welfare benefits. About 3/4 of them do, but that's not enough to keep them out of destitution. This is partly because of the erosion of the benefit rates, because of the cash freeze, which has brought benefit levels down, particularly for younger people and single people, down to destitution level or even below it. But it's also crucially because of the deductions from benefits, and those of you that saw the Channel 4 News item last night will have seen a discussion around that point. It's been a very important theme of the destitution study all 3 times that we've run it, is that people don't actually get the headline amount of money that they should get in benefits because of third-party and DWP debt deductions. And the particularly important one at the moment is deductions for UC advances. Also, some people are affected by benefit sanctions, of course, too, and also crucially shortfalls in the the help that they get to cover their housing costs because of LHA restrictions and the bedroom tax, and indeed the benefit cap. So this is partly about the starting point in terms of people's level of benefits, but it's also about the range of deductions they have from those benefits that are intended to cover essentials, but often are not enough to cover essentials because of those deductions. So in that context, one of the things that we've found in 2019 in both the qualitative and the quantitative research is the growing importance of food banks and churches and charities in meeting people's needs for essentials, particularly for food. We've seen a strong growth in the role played by food banks in the last couple of years, with a really quite a high proportion particularly of people with complex needs, but also other destitute groups reporting help from that source. And conversely, we've really seen a fading away of the role played by statutory local welfare funds, particularly in England, where relatively few people report either in-kind or cash help from that source. So finally, on the quantitative side of the findings, this is a map of GB showing the levels of the per capita rates of destitution, and the darker green represents where the rates are highest. And these rates are highest in generally in the north of the country, in north of England, northeast and northwest, parts of Scotland actually as well, and also parts of London. And generally the geographical concentration in the northern parts of the UK has increased since 2017, and we have the lower rates in the southern part of England in particular. So moving on in the time I have left to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the qualitative findings. There's a real wealth of data and insights on the qualitative interviews that we undertook in the report itself, but I want to just pick out today just a few key headline points on social security, on housing and on community services. Social security looms very large in the qualitative accounts, or problems with social security loom very large in the qualitative accounts that we gathered from people, in part because it's a minority of people who are destitute are in work. It's 14%, similar proportion as it was in 2017. And actually a very large majority, 54%, have a limiting health condition or disability. So people are very dependent or reliant on social security to meet their essential needs. And there were some positive messages coming across this year. The £20 per week uplift in UC was certainly was something that people, or some of the interviews had benefited from. The relaxation of conditionality was really a key benefit in that early stage of lockdown, and was well communicated, we heard, by DWP. And also, crucially, the suspension of debt deductions had eased pressure on households. The biggest issue, as I've already mentioned, was the repayment of UC advances that was plunging people into debt right from the beginning of their claim. And people made a very direct link in many cases between the repayment of these advances and the need to use food banks. Moving on to housing, people's ability to cope with lockdown, I mean, it seems an obvious thing to say, but it's worth emphasising that people's ability to cope with lockdown really turned crucially on the accommodation and the space that they had at their disposal. And a very strong theme throughout the study, particularly for migrant households and family households, was inadequate or overcrowded accommodation with little access to outside space, which really made it very difficult for households with children in particular. Just offered a quotation there that captures some of that. We also found that people living in hostels during lockdown really struggled with the very limited personal space and privacy they have, and also the increasing desperation of those around them. But even pre the COVID lockdown, housing issues, and particularly housing affordability, was a major problem for people experiencing destitution, especially in London. And one of the things that we found was people reporting, for example, paying their rent on credit cards and driving up really unaffordable levels of debt for themselves in order to avoid being evicted. Again, some of the measures taken under in the context of the COVID pandemic helped here. I mean, we encountered a number of people who had not been evicted because of the moratorium on evictions during COVID, but they were expecting to be when the court started to process eviction claims again. So, so the issues around housing were really important, not just within the context of the COVID pandemic, but more generally in driving people into destitution because of the difficulty they face in meeting their housing costs, but also in making it much more difficult to cope with the deprivations that they faced as well. Finally, I want to say a little bit about community services, especially in the context of the pandemic. People who were already struggling, and bear in mind everyone we interviewed was already destitute when we interviewed them in autumn 2019, and 2/3 were still destitute when we interviewed them in the spring of 2020. So these were people who were struggling anyway. And in the context of the pandemic, some struggled to access food banks because referral agencies, including Job Centre Plus, were closed or difficult to reach. Also, one of the things that really hit a lot of people hard, especially migrants and people with complex support needs, was the closure of charity shops and especially libraries. People relied on libraries for warmth some of the time, for company, but also crucially for access to IT. And I think one of the things that COVID-19 has really shone a light on is this digital divide and the consequences for people living in destitution. When they can't access the internet. They need it for a myriad of reasons, for processing their social security claims, for supporting their children's education, and accessing support services, and to overcome isolation as well, particularly during lockdown. So the closure of libraries and charity shops was a really big issue for people. What we also found is people that with complex support needs struggled more than others to cope with the shift to online or telephone-based support. So that was really a very big issue, particularly for people who, for example, have drug or alcohol problems. The final point here might sound like a really very specific one, but it was an incredibly important issue for a lot of people, and one would hope something that might be relatively easily resolved, which is that there was a lot of difficulty reported in people accessing local authority services during lockdown because of the unaffordable call charges that were imposed in telephone-based services. People who could normally walk to the council offices weren't able to do that, and they simply couldn't afford to be put through and put in a queue and so on. So to conclude, there's a lot in this report, and I hope you take the opportunity to read the main report and also the findings produced by JRF. And for those of you interested in the details of the more technical details, the technical report we've produced as well. But a few key takeaway points, I think, to finish up with. First of all, is that even pre the COVID pandemic, what we saw in the UK was increasing, intensifying destitution. And what we also saw were more families with children affected by that destitution. Excuse me. Once COVID hit, there were certainly some positives there, particularly the measures taken quickly and decisively by government around social security. They did ease the pressure in really important ways on households that were really struggling. But on the other side, people's experiences of lockdown were severely exacerbated by poor housing conditions, by digital exclusion, and by difficulties accessing services and goods from local authorities and some charities. And with that, I'll hand back over to Emma. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. I do encourage people to read the full report. There's also a technical report which will be circulating details of. Some of the questions that are starting to come through are quite specific, and I think many of them will be answered there, or you'll be able to make contact with the research team. The report it contains many sort of harrowing stories of experiencing destitution, some really hard-hitting statistics, but we feel that there's a great deal we can do and must do indeed, to end destitution. And I want to hand over to the panelists now to talk through some of those responses. So I'm going to start first of all with handing over to my colleague, Katie Schmucker, who's our Deputy Director of Policy and Partnerships, to respond to the report.
Thanks, Emma. So I think, given the colleagues that I've got on the panel with me today, I'm going to just focus on some of the more general things that we can do to tackle this rising tide of destitution. But before I do that, I think it's just worth saying that what we've seen between 2017 and 2019 is a sharp and unacceptable rise in the number of people who are destitute in our country. You know, Suzanne has set out very well and in a great level of detail the picture of that rise and, you know, who is affected by it. But I think that what we should certainly not shy away from is that, you know, what that really means is that there are a growing number of people in our country who are facing the distressing and degrading experience of being unable to afford to eat properly, to keep a roof over their heads in some cases, and where people do have homes, they're unable to heat them adequately and unable to afford basic toiletries like soap, shampoo. You know, these are the absolute bare essentials. And in a country like ours, it's simply not right that this is the case. But on the more positive side, you know, there are things that we know we can do to improve this situation. And what I want to talk about is some of the things that we can do to pull people back from the brink. First, and absolutely central, is that we need a social security system that keeps people afloat and isn't dragging them down. Early on in the pandemic, we saw bold and compassionate action very quickly, actually, from the government to increase the payments within universal credit and within working tax credits. There was a very quick acknowledgement that the level of support provided through these mechanisms is not sufficient, actually, for people to meet some of their needs. And so very quickly, those payments were increased by £20 per week. And that was the right thing to do then. And the right thing to do now is to make those increases permanent and to extend them to people who are on older legacy benefits, predominantly people who are disabled or carers, a group that we know is particularly affected by destitution. At the moment, that uplift to universal credit and working tax credits is due to come to an end at the end of March. But there is no conceivable scenario where that support is not going to continue to be needed into next year. So we would urge the government to confirm as soon as possible that that uplift universal credit is not only staying, but will be made a permanent part of the system. But we also need to redesign parts of universal credit. In particular, as Suzanne highlighted, that 5-week wait for the first payment within universal credit is a core driver of destitution. It forces people to have to borrow to be able to survive during that period. And then it leaves them facing unaffordable payments as they repay the debt of the advance that they have taken. Also very clear from this research, not just this time around, but the 2 times previously, as Suzanne mentioned, is that it's not just the advance for the 5-week wait that pushes people to destitution, but actually the deductions for other debts, whether that's to local authorities for council tax or whether that's to utilities companies. These are key themes that come out of the study. And we would say that the government must listen to the people who have experience of universal credit. They are experts in the system. They know what the impact of the system is on them and their families and their lives. Right from the off, it was clear, and organisations like ours, but also people themselves who are in receipt of benefits have said that the 5-week wait within universal credit was going to drive problems. It was going to drive debt and it was going to drive destitution. And that is certainly what we're seeing. And so we would say that we need to be working with the people who have experience of universal credit in order to redesign the system and make sure that those debt deductions are affordable and to make sure that people are not being pushed into destitution by the system. Secondly, we need to be tackling the high costs that have driven destitution. Clearly, there is a need to close the gaping gap between people's housing costs and their income. And again, the social security system has a role to play there. But actually, in the longer run, the solution has to be building more genuine, affordable social housing. But there's also a looming threat on the horizon. Rent arrears have been building throughout this year as people's incomes have been hit by the pandemic. Come March, the protections that have been in place for renters are due to come to an end. If we don't act, we may well see a wave of evictions in the spring and summer next year. So this is why the JRF has called for a targeted grants programme to support private and social renters who have fallen into arrears which they will otherwise struggle to pay back. Thirdly, and the final thing I want to talk about this morning is one of the many shocking things about this research is quite how many destitute people are working. 1 in 7 of people were in work. People have found themselves trapped in low paid and insecure work, often not knowing from 1 week to the next if they're going to be working 40 hours, 10 hours, no hours, and trying to manage a household income on that basis is just impossible. In the last Queen's speech, the government committed to bring forward an employment bill. And we would say that this bill must be brought forward with urgency, and it must be used to reduce the insecurity for low paid workers by extending employment rights to them and investing in strong and effective enforcement mechanisms. None of us in our society want to see a society where food bank use is soaring. None of us wants our society to be one where homelessness is soaring. And none of us wants our society to be one where children are having to grow up in families that are facing the humiliation of destitution. So we must fix this. And we know many of the things that will help us to fix this. What we need now is the bold and compassionate action to make those changes. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. I want to hand over now to Tracy Harrington. Tracy is here representing Poverty to Solutions. He's the manager of Thrive Teesside. Poverty Solutions are one of the lived experience partners that JRF work with, and I think she'll be echoing some of the things that Katie's just said. Tracy.
Thank you. I'll just get my voice right first. Yeah, my name's Tracy Harrington. I'm the manager of Thrive, and we're based in Stockton-on-Tees. So obviously quite aware of the issues that are facing our community. But today I'm here representing Poverty to Solutions. We're a coalition of 3 groups. So it's Thrive Teesside, ATD Fourth World, who are based in London, and Dole Animators that are based in Leeds. We've been working together now for 3 years, but we also work alongside other areas of expertise. So we have a policy worker that works with us, we have a graphic designer, and we also have an academic. So what we try to do is merge the areas of expertise in order to develop solutions that meet the needs of our community. So we're a firm believer that it is with lived experience, when you're using that unique expertise around the table on any given issue, that is key to affecting any type of change that will make a difference to particularly for us low-income communities. It's our expertise and our knowledge and insight that is often overlooked when decisions are made or policies are implemented. So to involve this unique area of insight and expertise, it will be key to effecting transformative change. We know the government in Westminster are quite detached from the realities, particularly in our low-income communities, and particularly in the northern part of England, and arguably I would agree with that. They may have the power and they may have some knowledge, but they don't have the insight, and they don't understand or fully understand the implications of a policy on a low-income community. So even if intentions are honourable, their desired outcomes may not be achieved. We know that inequality is rising, and the gaps in inequality are widening. We know more children are living in poverty. We know it's very difficult to secure full-time employment. We've heard the results from this report today, and we know the social security system or the welfare system is not fit for purpose. That's the reality of the situation we're living in. So it's the vision, the long-term vision of Poverty to Solutions, put the voice of lived experience at the heart of policy making. And part of our work now is to demonstrate by doing. We need to evidence our approach to show what's the value of adopting or adhering to lived experience around and that expertise around the table. So we are going to demonstrate by doing. and we're going to be solution focused, and we're going to look at an area around debt deductions. So we welcome GRF's recommendation there about debt deductions and ensuring that the call upon the government is to work in partnership with people with lived experience of the social security system to ensure that debt deductions from any benefit, not just universal credit, but the legacy benefits as well, are not drivers for hardship, and that they then don't force people into destitution or force people to have to borrow and to get into more debt. We know what the scale of the problem is at the moment. In particular, we can find a lot of information and statistics around deductions from universal credit. What we can't find a lot of at the moment is deductions from job seekers allowance and income support, all and legacy benefits. Prior to COVID-19, you have to excuse me a minute because I keep shuffling bits of paper. So I'm aware. So prior to COVID-19, there were almost a fifth of universal credit claimants were currently having 30% or more of their standard allowance deducted. That equated then at that time to 470,000 households. That's 470,000 people who live in a household that were impacted by these deductions. Deductions and social security system, social security entitlement was very little to live off in the first place. So people were already in hardship at that time and couldn't afford to live or fulfill their livelihoods. So then to have 30% taken off that very small amount of money pushed people further into destitution. I think it's worth also bearing in mind when I'm talking about the value of lived experience. So we need to understand why or what the rhetoric is behind taking a deduction from somebody's benefit. And the wording on the government website is the third-party deduction scheme is designed to protect claimants that are in receipt of income-related benefits, and they're only taken off when it is in the interest of the claimant. Now, I would argue that that's not in the interest of the claimant, having this amount of money taken off, and I think our community who are having a deduction taken from their benefits would also say that it is not in their interest to have this amount of money taken from their claim. So we must remember, and this is the insight that's missing when decisions or policies are implemented, and I think that's quite key to remember that and focus on that when we're talking about the value of having somebody who has experience of the social security system to talk about that. So when I mentioned 470,000 people there, I didn't mention anyone who was on a legacy benefit. So this was prior to the coronavirus. But I don't know if people have been watching lately, there's been a response to government, calling for evidence in relation to debt deductions. And there were a number of leading national organisations that have been providing this evidence. So the Trussell Trust reported almost half of all households arriving at food banks during the pandemic are repaying debts to the UK government. This is a significant rise. CPAG have done a report, the Money Advice Trust, Step Change, and there's probably a lot more that I haven't obviously took account of just yet, but just to recognise that this is an ongoing issue and this is becoming to the attention of many people. So the reasons though for people actually having the debt deductions is rising food and fuel. It is having no savings and the inability to buy essentials, particularly around the advance loan or repayment. But also we must remember a lot of people are paying back a debt deduction because there are systemic failings within the system itself. So they'll be overpaid something and then have to repay it back. And that happens quite a lot. I think that's the majority of cases at the moment. So I'll just get my next piece of paper, sorry. So that's the scale of the problem that we found today. We know the government's responses, and some of these points have been coming up already. We know during the pandemic, the suspended repayments for a short while, so we know that they can do it. We know they reduced the repayments from 40% to 30%. We know that there's going to be a breathing space next year where there'll be a period of time to reflect on debt deductions. And we also know they're going to extend the repayment from 12 months to 16 months. So this is an issue that can be responded to and responded to quite effectively. But again, it's about having a discussion with a person with lived experience around the table or a coalition of people who were speaking on behalf of the community in order to make sure that the responses and the solutions totally consider what the reality will be in the future. I'd just like to end when I'm talking about stats. I mean, we're not a big stats person generally, but we know we need to do that to build our case and have evidence. but this is the reality of a lot of people in our community. And we've been gathering some personal stories at the moment. And so just to put it into context of the impact on a person's life, is somebody will have a deduction taken from their benefits, their allowance each week. They've already planned and budgeted for what they're going to pay for, what food they're going to get, how much they're going to put on the gas and the electric, for example. Then an unexpected deduction will come out with no prior warning, no consent, no understanding of when that will end, and then that will impact on their ability to buy something that week. We have a person that has now reduced their income to £56 or £55.50 per week because of a number of debt deductions. Now, I can't put words to what I'm thinking at the moment, because that is the harsh reality of people who are living in our communities and the scale of the deductions that are coming on and the impact that has in their daily life. Now, this is the reality at the moment. This is the situation that we're living in, and this is where we will call upon the government to act and work with people with lived experience in order to address the problem in a sustainable and effective way. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. A very powerful end to your comments. Okay, could I ask Dr. Kezia Reeve to speak next? Kezia's been a member of our Project Advisory Group. She's a Principal Research Officer at the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research at Sheffield Hallam.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to be as brief as I can be, so I'll try and respond to that. I wanted to start by saying just what such an important piece of work this is. It's a great shame that the results make for such grim reading, but it is so crucial that we have this evidence. You know, it should be absolutely inconceivable in a nation like ours that anybody should be destitute. But a case for change can't be made without evidence. And in a sense, that is, if we're talking about what can be done, that is always the first step, to have really good evidence. And what we have here is strong, robust and longitudinal evidence that can't be disputed, and that shows absolutely that destitution does exist in this country. And not only that, but it is increasing dramatically. And so hopefully that now can't be ignored. So in terms of what we can do, well, this is the first step. One of the strengths of the report for me, and I will try and keep this really brief, is the way that they've used that ongoing study to explore the impacts of the pandemic on destitution, because I think through that, it really brings home the precariousness of people's lives, destitute people generally, and people with complex needs as well. Specifically, of just how few resources they have, and you know, it exposes how reliant people are on, you know, for their very survival, on support services, goodwill, charities, you know, and that becomes more evident when you look in at a context, i.e. the pandemic, where those things are removed, and you realise just how devastating that is to people. So I think that's really, really powerful. And I know, you know, Suzanne's already talked about the way that people with complex needs, you know, they need libraries, not to borrow books like I do, but to keep warm and for company and to use the internet. And so, you know, it really highlights that devastating kind of impact, but also how people, very, very vulnerable people, are meeting their material needs in this way. And it makes us realise that, I think, and think, you know, what kind of a society do we live in where that can be the case? The thing with people with complex needs, which I just wanted to focus on, is that it's not just in their material life, of course, that they are, that, you know, their material lives that are precarious. That extends to their health, their mental health, capacity to abstain from drugs and alcohol, keeping safe from domestic violence. So people are managing those really, really difficult issues and are fragile as a result. And so that kind of complex needs group, you know, they're fragile materially in relation to their destitution, but they're also fragile, you know, in terms of their complex needs. And we know that in the pandemic, it's the very issues that people with complex needs struggle with that have been adversely affected. It's affected people's mental health. Domestic violence has gone through the roof. You know, and managing those kinds of issues requires support from others, from organisations, distractions, activities, face-to-face contact, you know, and how do you meet those needs if the services and spaces are closed and you're homeless with no money and no internet access trying to manage a mental health problem? Where is the resilience in the system, you know, for people in those situations? And that is what needs to change. I am hopeful, well, I hope, this might be optimistic, that the COVID pandemic has made us look at our society and how it operates. I like to think there's been a degree of collective soul searching, I hope. You know, this could, and actually absolutely must, represent a moment of change. You know, we have to rebuild stuff. So let's rebuild so that the operation of a day centre doesn't make the difference between somebody surviving or not, or somebody being destitute or not. I always find it quite difficult when I'm thinking about social problems and what the solutions are. And I have to do this a lot in my work as well as a researcher. We have to make policy recommendations, and, you know, and you can think of lots of changes that can be made and lots of initiatives, and they all, you know, policy tweaks here and there, and they all make a massive difference to people's day-to-day lives. But to some extent, that is tinkering around the edges. And I'm sorry that I don't have a really nice sort of list of very, very specific suggestions. But I just think tinkering around the edges doesn't cut it. You know, this research has showed that we have an absolute crisis. You know, this isn't a few people falling through the gaps. This is a fundamental problem. And so we need some fundamental system change, I think. And, you know, we shouldn't shy away from saying that and from asking about that, asking for that. What we need is a comprehensive, adequate welfare system, ultimately. That is what we need. Exactly what that looks like, I don't know, but it certainly looks like within the social security system that nobody should, you know, fall below a basic livable income. We've talked about, you know, the uplift, the way that the uplift on universal credit has mitigated destitution, you know, suspending deductions from benefits and so on. Right, great, let's keep those. But alongside that, let's say that whatever system is in place where those things exist, they should never, ever drop somebody below that basic income. And I think the report talks about destitution by design. You know, we have a benefit system where people are destitute and they're on benefits. I mean, that is just utterly ridiculous. That should not happen. So there is something there about basic income. But in relation to people with complex needs as well, that welfare, that broader welfare support has to include you know, a comprehensive, well-funded and well-coordinated system of support services. At the moment, there are amazing things going on out there, but it is a patchwork of fragmented, short-term funded projects that have to close or adapt to some new funding stream just as they're making an impact. And we just can't have a situation where really vulnerable, destitute people are meeting their needs in that way. Yeah. So I'm sorry I don't have really specific suggestions, but, you know, there needs to be wholesale change. That's my suggestion.
Thank you very much. And you'll see from the questions that many people will probably agree with you. I mean, I'm conscious of time and I want to give Renee a chance to speak. So we're not going to get on to probably more than one question, but people are suggesting kind of fundamental things and even questioning whether there should be a kind of legal duty on governments to end destitution, or for local authorities to have welfare schemes in place. This is in England, they're already there in devolved administrations, and but the impact of those I don't think we're aware of. So I'd like to hand over finally then to Renee Mann, who Renee works for NACOM. She's recently joined as the Chief Executive. NACOM have been working with us closely through their involvement in our project advisory group, and their work is about preventing destitution amongst people seeking asylum, refugees and other migrants, which is a really important part of the destitute population.
Thanks so much, Emma, and to everyone at JRF. It's a really excellent and important report. So I'm here representing the No Accommodation Network, as Emma's introduced. We're a community of 135 charities across the UK who provide accommodation support and support to people seeking asylum, refugees and migrants with unresolved or insecure immigration status. And we advocate for an end to destitution for everybody in the immigration system. So our insight into destitution for people subject to immigration control. Over the last year, we accommodated 1,686 people who were subject to no recourse to public funds conditions. And 82% of people referred to us were street homeless. That includes people who were sofa surfing and rough sleeping. We've seen a significant increase in the number of people who are destitute who we've had to turn away, in particular over the last 3 years, and in particular for the 2,000 people in the last year that we've provided financial support to only, who we couldn't accommodate. So our key reflections on the JRF report, we absolutely echo the desire expressed in today's report to live in a country where everyone can afford to eat, stay dry, warm and clean. The fact is that for people who are migrants with unresolved or insecure immigration status with NRPF conditions, they are denied this fundamental power. They experience absolute destitution. There is no safety net. They cannot meet their basic needs for food, shelter, warmth or hygiene. They have no power to change their situation, no legal representation to regularise their status and no permission to work. This is a population of critical concern to us at the NACOM network. JRF is right to highlight the destitution experienced by people in the asylum accommodation. While they have shelter and food, their essential needs are not being met. Let's remember that they receive 40% of over 25's universal credit, often for years, and they have no power to change their situation and have no permission to work. People with NRPF are forced also into exploitative, unsafe living conditions and are invisible to statutory authorities who can keep them safe and enable them to access justice and regularise their status. And their options are so limited and the consequences for their lives are very grave. The JRF research highlights the complexity of people's situations, their needs, and the lack of agency to resolve them. This is only amplified for people in the immigration system. We wholly support the report's conclusion that COVID-19 has demonstrated the fragility of the systems that migrants rely upon to survive. Once employment's removed, NRPF restrictions plunge them into poverty and homelessness, and a voluntary sector ill-equipped to support them. With one point of clarification or focus that we'd like to highlight in the report. Chapter 5 of the report focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on people with migrants with experience of destitution. It rightly name checks the key challenges that COVID-19 presented for different groups, but it stops short of confirming what we know that the COVID-19 crisis has exposed: the failures of our immigration system, the entrenched, systematic and intergenerational inequalities, exclusion and discrimination that people seeking asylum, refugees and migrants face through hostile environment policies. The destitution is caused by these policies created by political decisions which can and must be changed. So very briefly, the immediate and short-term changes that we're calling for. We applaud the report's endorsement of calls by local authorities, social landlords and charities like ours for the government to lift restrictions on access to public funds for people subject to NRPF conditions or with limited benefit entitlements for at least a year, or at the very least access to local welfare fund assistance for people in emergency situations. We're also calling on the Home Office to maintain the current pause on evictions for people who've been refused asylum whilst COVID-19 remains a threat. And for people in asylum accommodation must be provided with adequate advice, support and help to help them progress their cases and make informed choices about their futures. No one should be made destitute during a pandemic. For people who are migrants with no recourse to public funds, but not in the asylum system, we're calling for a similar common sense approach. The Home Office must suspend no recourse to public funds conditions and work with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government and relevant housing departments in constituent nations to provide adequate funding and clear guidance for local authorities so they can fully support everyone at risk of homelessness in their communities. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Renee. That was really powerful and a reminder about the specific experiences of migrants and how we want to make sure that no one is destitute regardless of their immigration status. We are at 12 o'clock and we've had lots of questions through. I think what we're going to do is, rather than rush through responses now, is to find a way of dealing with those. Obviously, we're very, very happy for people to kind of contact us and to discuss destitution further with us. There's a wealth of evidence in the report, and JRF and indeed I'm sure the research team would be happy to kind of work with people to make sure that that evidence is used and makes a difference to people who are experiencing destitution, and also the services that work with them. And I know there's many people on the call who are in that position. So we'll do that then. We've listened very carefully to what people have said. Some of the answers already in the technical report, others will need to kind of reflect upon. There's one question we don't have time to answer, but perhaps something for us all to kind of think about then, and that's what we would all want to do as individuals then to support people to end destitution. What can we do? So that's perhaps something for us to reflect upon. Of course, I would say read the full report as a starting point, but there are things we can do. Maybe that is tinkering a little bit at the edges, which Kezia warned us about, but perhaps ultimately then we can have a vision of doing something that will tackle such a big issue as destitution. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining us today. We've had almost 200 people on the call at times. Almost everyone's still with us. So thank you very much. And I also want to have a particular thanks to the JRF events team, who are literally behind the scenes. They're behind that image of on our screens now, who've worked so hard then to get this event up and running. So thank you all for your time and your interest. And I hope we can continue the conversations to try and end destitution. Thank you.